president of the Penfield Heritage Association. I thank you all for coming. What a crowd. Wow, great. Would you all be here on Super Bowl Sunday? Okay. We usually have refreshments. We do. Hopefully we got enough. There's coffee, there's tea, there's cookies, and hope to help yourself to that at any time. If anybody is not a member would like to join our group as the Penfield Heritage Association, you're welcome to do that. Our treasurer is back here, Jean Casey. She'll gladly accept a cash or a check for $10 for an individual or $15 for a family for 1 year. We usually have a half a dozen lectures during the course of a year. We have a summer picnic and a holiday Christmas party. Next month on February 27th, I'm gonna have a lecture on area farmers here in Penfield and what they can do, what they've done in the past, what they can do to keep going, and what we as Penfield citizens can help them out with buying their produce, such as that. There are several different farms I go to. Other than that, I might as well get this program started so we can all get, it's a little warm in here, so we can all get out and get some nice cold air out there. And I'm not on a roof today. So I'm going to introduce Jeff Vincent. He is our speaker on the history of Corbett's Glen and his assistants. Dan, Steve.
Thank you.
Good job.
It would seem that every friend I have in the world is here, which is just glorious. This is a celebration. I'd like to acknowledge a few things. The Corbett's Glen Preservation Group that I'm associated with, they're selling cookbooks over there of Corbett's Glen, a very wonderful document. And I'd like to acknowledge Bill Hosley for writing the book Special Places, which got this area history put down in a very readable way. I don't have a mic. And I have water though. That'll keep me going. And I'd like to acknowledge Jim Weller over here in the yellow sweater. He's offered an awful lot of history that's made this much more special because of his research. He's put together 12 volumes of history of the area from Clover Street to Linden Oaks and north and south of that. It's every building from when it was first settled to the present. Everybody that lived there, the story behind each person that used that property. So I'd also like to acknowledge Bill Burke, who did the technical work on these posters. They're made of Tyvek and they'll last forever. These posters are my low-tech method, but most of what we'll be showing are the high-tech ones. And I'm only supposed to be an hour, right? And so when you start rolling your eyes, because I've given you too much information, then I'll bring out the monkey organs. There are 3 of them back there. I'll bring them up and demonstrate them and give you a little background. And those of you that want to leave after that, I'll be highly insulted. But we can keep going all evening if you like, as long as the library is open. I will talk because it's a fun subject. So I've taken care of a couple things on the list. Charlie asked me to do this, and I use it as an excuse to just do further research. So these ones that are done that are not too, that are pretty flimsy, those are what's come up new since the celebration we had on September 12th. I don't know how many of you were there, but it was quite an extravaganza. I don't know if we'll ever be able to pull that off again because everything worked like clockwork. So Charlie asked me to do this, so it was an excuse to be like a kid in a candy store, and I've spent the last month getting ready for it, pulling together new information, new old information that hasn't been available otherwise. There's so many things I'd like to say, but I'm going to have to kind of hold it in. But I'll give some connections by why I became interested in this area. And I think you'll find it fun because it's personal. When I was a little kid in 1958 era, my family was good friends with the Beers family. Ellen Adams is still there, and her mother, we'd come and visit after church on Sunday, and I'd look through the tunnel, and I was afraid to go through. But little did I know that we'd live there someday when I was 5 years old. That was one connection. And then another one, we had a camp on Gannett Hill, our family did. And next to that camp was a private picnic ground. So I developed an interest in private picnic grounds, naturally. And that's what Corbett's Glen was. And then I have this strong interest in bells. And you'll find some bell things here. And I have a strong interest in mills. I read the books of Eric Sloan. And then I read a reminiscence of a lady in East Rochester about her childhood growing up on Spring Lake when it was a mill dam, and how wonderful that was. So that spurred my interest in mills. And then finally, I have a love of fountains, and it'll be fun to bring out the fact that the neighbors around us in Corbett's Glen loved fountains also. So to start with, when you go down 441 going east, there's the firehouse. I know you can't see this, but you just have to imagine. So let's try this out. You're going down 441, that's Linden Avenue 441. Little do you know that there's a bridge under here. And the bridge was considered so scenic that they did a bunch of postcards back at the turn of the century. Each one is a different photograph, and each one is colored in. It was like a European scene, an arched stone bridge that took Linden Avenue to Penfield. It was only 18 feet wide, and here's Zoller. He did it in color, 1924. He also did Corbett's Glen. He thought it was so scenic. So there's the same bridge. Well, around 1930, they added about 10 feet to each side, and it looked like this. So here's a car going east towards Penfield on Linden Avenue. There's the Barnes Mill. There's the bridge wall right there. And then what we find is the bridge is still there. It's encased with concrete right underneath. You can see it here. And then they added another 30 feet on this side, and then when they finished the 441, it's now 160 feet long. So from 18 feet to 160 feet wide, a good representation of what you can do with cheap oil. But I think after this weekend, things will be a little different. So next we have the milling. So we can take this one down and put that next one up here. So as with many places, like in Penfield on the Rundecoit Creek, there were 15 mills over time providing different services for the community because there was no other way to get the power if it wasn't done with animals or people. And the same true of the Allen's Creek area. There were numerous mills. There were more than one sawmill at the same time. There was a grist mill. There was a woolen mill. And have you ever heard of the author, the poet Ezra Pound? Well, Elijah Pound owned the woolen mill back in 1830, right where near the Friendly home. That's right where that bridge is. That's where all the mills were. There were further mills down in Corbett's Glen and down in Burroughs Hills area, but the main concentration of mills was there. And so the woolen mill, there were 600,000 sheep in 1820 in the Rochester area, because they would mow your lawn and you could eat them. And then they'd provide the wool. There was a woolen mill downtown, and there was a little woolen mill there in the settlement of Allen's Creek. There was also a cotton mill, which will come into this discussion a little later. I don't know where the woolen mill was, the large woolen mill was located, but I do know where the cotton mill, and that also works into the Corbett's Glen history in a very interesting way. So you have the mills, and most of them we have no record of as far as visually. We do have a document here that Jim Weller came up with a couple weeks ago. And what happened was there's a dam. Let's see, I don't have the dam one up right now. Let's see, where is that? That's coming up. Oh, okay. Yes, we do have photographs of the dam. There it is, which I'm amazed. I never thought I'd get to see the dam, but somebody took color pictures in the 40s, late 40s. So here it is in the winter. It's a wooden dam. There it is in the summer right there. And that dam supplied the Barnes Mill on the other side of Linden Avenue. And, well, there was a conflict because the other side of the creek on the west side right here flooded, and the guy that owned that property broke the dam, and so the guy running Charlie Barnes no longer had water to run his mill, so he sued the guy, and this is the suit. This is the record that tells the history of all the mills in that area, what they were used for, who owned them, who moved them from one place to another. So I'm glad that guy broke that dam, because I wouldn't have this information otherwise.
Jeff?
Yes.
Is this the one you see as you look towards the Friendly Home?
Yes.
Across from the parking lot of the fire hall?
Yes, it's right there. So there are remnants of this dam. Originally it was a stone dam, and it was diagonal by agreement with the two owners on both sides of the creek. And these maps show it being diagonal right there. And then you have the mill race taking it down to the mill, the Barnes Mill. And so the remnants are interesting. As I look, I see, oh, there's these things sticking out of the bedrock. And there's the entrance to the mill race. It's still there. So you have that line at a diagonal, which would hold this structure in place. And it was supposed to be kept a foot above the normal level to provide the water for the mill. The mill lasted until 1953, and then they put in the expressway. So Charlie Barnes was the last of the Barnes, and he never got married. And so when he got the word, well, that was that. There wasn't much demand for his product. The product was feed mostly to supply the chicken farm, which is where Harper's Trailer Park is now. So there were, did I say I was done? No. Just hold it up. That's your punishment. Just hold it up.
Give us good instructions.
I know, I'm not good at managing. I'm good at coming up with fun stuff. And so you have all these articles that were published in the Brighton Pittsford Post and so forth, describing what was so neat about this mill. So just like the bridge that we described at the beginning, this mill was considered the most scenic place in the region. So RIT would send out its artists, and there'd be as many as 24 artists painting this scene at one time in the 30s. This is Harwood Dreyer. He did this painting of it. He's an architect. And this is Ruth Porter. Her father was quite a photographer. Ruth Porter is related to Marshfield Parsons, who started the Parsons powder mill, which we'll get into later. Parsons is a big name around the settlement of Allen's Creek. So you have a lot of artwork of the Barnes Mill. It exists somewhere, but I haven't found too much of it. But there are, obviously, if there were that many people painting it, there must be a lot of examples around. And so today, if you go to that location, this is what it looks like. That's 490. And if you look off the Linden Avenue Bridge, that's what you see looking east. That's where the mill was, right there. But luckily, because it was so scenic, we have a lot of photographs and artwork of it. So
When did they start building that mill at Martinsville?
this was moved from the west side of Allen's Creek to the east side at some point around 1885. I didn't know it was that late. And then it lasted till 1853. 1953. And so, yeah, we're done. Yeah, next one. So how many of you were at the celebration in September? So you remember seeing these powder mill posters, so I don't have to say anything? You can put the other ones up now. So what I find interesting is that Marshfield Parsons started the powder mill up in the settlement of Allen's Creek, right near the Friendly home, because there weren't many people at the time, and even though it was dangerous, they felt they could get away with it. Well, that was 1823 that he started advertising to sell his product of making gunpowder for the needs of the burgeoning country. But he had to move it down into Corbett's Glen around 1930. But yet we have a photograph of him. That's Marshfield Parsons. He only lived to about 53 years old, I think. And his great-great-granddaughter, Ruth Parsons, lives on Elmwood Avenue. She's 92 years old. She's the one that did that painting of the mill. So the Penfield connection with the mill is that Calvin Wooster kept good diaries, and every time the powder mill in Corbett's Glen blew up, it did blow up 8 times between 1830 and 1860. He would mention it in his diary, and here it is. So we don't have any photographs of that mill, obviously, because it was before photography. But we do have photographs from other mills that were larger and drawings. So what the Corbett's Glen powder mill consisted of 5 large buildings, and they had berms, and they were separated by 24 feet each. In case there was an explosion, it wouldn't take them all, it would just take one. And the idea was to get the thing going. It used water power from the waterfall next to the culvert, the tunnel, and it probably had a race that took it down a couple thousand feet into the Glen. And then they would get the machinery running and then leave as soon as possible because they didn't want to get blown up. And the machinery they used, according to the articles that are in the paper here about the explosions, describes very clearly that it was a cylinder type machine, and they would mix up the ingredients and put it in that cylinder that was water powered. It would turn all the time to grind up the material, and they'd put balls, brass balls in there, hundreds of them, to help grind it up. So whenever there was an explosion, thousands of balls would go all over the place, and they'd find them all the way over to the Stone Tolan house when they were doing their gardening and their farming. Well, today the guys come with their metal detectors and they find them, and they have 50 of them so far. Here are 2 of those balls. So you can pass that around. So it was secluded enough so that they could get away with it was on the side of a hill, so if there was an explosion, it went to the east, because there was the Stoneburner farm on the other side of that hill in the Glen. Stoneburner lived there before Corbett. It was called Stoneburner's Glen, and he was a dirt farmer. So there was a lot of enjoyment, I guess, of describing all the gory details of these explosions. And a guy would end up a half a mile away, or the guys would end up in the tree and hanging. And it was just, death was an everyday thing back then. And they weren't so upset about it when it did take place, I guess. People were expendable. So I guess we have to move on to the next one, as much as I'd like to keep talking. Usually there'd be either nobody killed because nobody was around at the time it exploded, or 1 to 5. Often it was 1 or 2 people. Sometimes as many as 5 were killed.
Want this one down?
Yes, please.
Mills in Allen's Creek in general, the headwaters of Allen's Creek in those days, and how far did the mills go upstream?
They went to the other side of East Avenue. There was a sawmill just to the east of there. There might have been a few more further up, but there wasn't much of a drop. So the drop started at that point and ended up down in Panorama Plaza, where Stoneburner had a forge, and he probably took the peat out of the, whatever it was, out of the ground and made iron implements from that. The Burroughs farm had a lumber mill using the creek water from that property. So there wasn't much of a drop down in there either, but he found enough to run a sawmill. The Corbett family. Patrick was a young boy, was born in Rochester, and then very young boy, he went to Canada to live. And when he was legal 17, he came back to Rochester for whatever reasons, and farmed in Mendon, and he had his eye on this Corbett's Glen property for quite a while, and farmed it on a land contract and built up connections. And Irish Catholic, 8 children. I was at the one of the high rises on East Avenue looking for a retired tuner, because I'm a piano tuner, to talk with him. But the first guy that came to the door was good friends with Patrick's grandson, and the next person I saw, a lady, was a Corbett. And I didn't think there were any Corbetts around. And this is a picture she gave me of 2 of the daughters. And so there are 4 boys and 4 daughters. You can see in this postcard of Corbett's Glen, this was purchased by the family. It wasn't well distributed. It was just a family postcard. You can see somebody standing on the front porch. And there's
What's the date on that picture of your house?
This is 1897. This is an article in the newspaper saying Mr. Corbett is building a fine new house in Allen's Creek, and who's doing the work. So what happened is that Patrick was thinking ahead all the time, and getting a little ahead of myself, that the trestle was filled in 1880, so they had to take some of it down in order to get the archway in. So he kept all that wood, put it aside, 1880 to 1896, 16 years later, he used that wood to build our house. So if you look, it's not on this one, but if you go in our basement, a whole house is held up with beams from the trestle. So we were wondering what the trestle looked like. We had no idea we were standing on it. And the house will hold any amount of weight, which is a good thing because of the kind of stuff we collect is heavy. And the beams are only about 8 inches apart, and they're very large. So that was exciting to find that out. We haven't found any photographs of it yet, but we do have a surprise for you here that will come up soon about the trestle. So Patrick built the house in 1896, and here the house is being finished up because there's no treatments on the windows, and there's a ladder in the back. That's his youngest daughter, Agnes, who's right here. And you can see the paint pail on the so we used this photograph to restore the house. The house was missing all this detail when we bought it, and it had green asphalt shingle. And so we could make use of this to bring it back to its original appearance. So Patrick was Canadian, and the Gleason family was Canadian too. And that's part of the story here that we'll get to soon. So there's quite a strong Canadian connection with the Rochester population. I guess the next thing is farming. Yeah, that can come down, and you can put the irrigation one up, because the next subject is irrigation. That's a fun one for me because, like I said, I like fountains and I like mechanical things. Patrick Corbett was very clever. So what he did, when we get this one up, I can show. He saw all that water coming down the creek, and he had a piece of property that was beautiful bog property. So that meant, gee, I have water, good soil, I can grow celery. So what he did is he put a dam in right here. This photograph just turned up a couple weeks ago. The Burroughs family keeps coming up with wonderful photographs of their farm. Well, the Burroughs family, you'll have to come to Corbett's Glen, and here they are down next to the waterfall, next to the tunnel. And the artifact that's in the back is a dam. Well, that didn't work out too well, because as soon as a storm comes along, it's gone. And so he had to resort, sure. But leave the beers, please. Oh no, you have to put that up, I'm sorry. I'm not thinking. Go ahead, I should be thinking, but put it back up because I'm not done. What was that? You're fired. So since that didn't work, that got, I assume, got taken away by the first big storm. He had to resort to something else. And so these other photographs don't show a dam. And so what I found one day looking around in the stream is a pipe that goes down in about 5 inches. And it's about 8 inches in diameter, and that's how he ended up bringing it in from a little depression in the bedrock. So he would bring it in up around the corner. He had a pump house, and Dickie Commisso, who worked at the East Rochester car shops, lives on 9 Mile Point Road, spent a lot of time in Corbett's Glen, and he remembers around the corner here of the tunnel the pump house plus a tower, and he thought it might have been for a windmill to generate power to pump the water up. It might have been to hold a big tank to pump it up. But whatever, he was able to find the power to get it and out and work these sprays right here, these irrigation, all throughout Corbett's Glen. There were these pipes, and let's see, I have a picture of one here. Where is it? Right there. I found this pipe next to the embankment, and that's where you'd put the crank in to turn it. This is the valve to turn on the water. So that's a remnant from that photograph there of the irrigation system. So Patrick lived till 1936. In the meantime, Leroy Beers was in the pump business, moves in to the other side of the Glen, in 1926. So Beers and Corbett must have been good friends. And Leroy was an inveterate tinkerer. So he built this water wheel next to his house on the other side of Corbett's Glen. As you go down Glen Road, it's the Walter Hagen house that he purchased in 1926. So he built that just because he was in the pump business. He liked doing that kind of stuff. And that would pump water up to his gardens. And so here's a picture of his garden, right? Let's see. Right there. Let's move this over a little. Probably can't see it, but you have to believe me. There are pipes in here. So he's pumping water up to his garden just like Patrick is. And he also had lots of fountains. And then he had this dam that he was able to purchase the steel after the Second World War. And it's interesting because there's a weight here. So if the water level gets too high, it automatically goes over and down about 3 or 4 feet in height. So it's very clever that he could protect the dam at high water by this method of this thing on a cable with right here. There's the cable, and it would automatically save itself by letting the water out. And in the Glen property, we can see another remnant of the irrigation system. Here's a pipe that's sticking out of the bog, the trail around the Glen. If you go in there, you can find that. And here's a piece of farm machinery that's still there, that was never taken away. And this is from a 1940 film down where our barn is. And there's another picture of the irrigation. Here they're sitting next to the stone burner house, and there's some more irrigation pipe. I think that about covers it. This is a painting by Seth Jones, when his middle name was Corbett. He's not related to the Corbetts, but he had some affinity probably. They called him Corby. Well, Seth Jones did one of the murals, paintings of Rochester history in the teens, 1915 era. That was there are 8 or 10 of them, and they're being custodian to the Rochester Historical Society now, and they're trying to get them restored. And he did one of those paintings. He did a lot of paintings, and he did this of Corbett's Glen. Yes.
When was the trestle built, and what happened during the Civil War with it?
We've heard that it was guarded by Civil War soldiers because it was a tenuous link to the Ohio Valley, so it's pretty critical that remain intact. But it was built in 1853. And so we'll be able to see what that looks like when we get to some of the other posters.
Jeff, was the irrigation system overhead or underground?
Well, overhead from the photographs right here. What? Is that a trick question? Why would you do that to me here in front of all these people?
What was unique about the Corbett irrigation?
You want to come up and talk? You do a much better job.
Typically, irrigation systems are subsurface. The Corbett irrigation system was overhead, and so it was able to spray large quantities of water pumped out of the creek down onto the celery beds and the other cash crop vegetables, which made it quite unique. Am I correct?
Keep talking. So far we have 2 dams we've covered, 3 dams that we have record of on Allen's Creek. And we've covered, let's see, Charles Barnes had a fountain also, and that was probably why people thought it was so picturesque to have that along with all the other elm trees and the old mill and the fountains. And somebody else had fountains too. And that was Kate Gleason, but she'll come up later. She's part of the Corbett's Glen history.
Jeff?
Yes.
The dam the dam that was right near your house, in the, under the tunnel, was that built like on top, there's a falls there now, but was it built like on top of the falls to make the falls taller?
Right on the bedrock. It was wooden,
So it's built right on, right there?
about 15 feet back from the falls.
Ah, got it, okay.
The Penfield connection, here's the Penfield line, there's Corbett's Glen, this is Penfield Road going east, and there's the Burroughs Farm. The Burroughs Farm is of interest because when they picnicked in Corbett's Glen in 1900 to 1925, it wasn't really in Corbett's Glen apparently, it was on Burroughs property. So what we have is the rustic bridge, and they go across the rustic bridge, and there was a trail that took you over another bridge, which is on this drawing, and then you'd go onto this pasture with a hill on the side, and that's where they had their picnics. And so you can see in this drawing, done in 1924 by Merle Alling, of the Alling and Corey family. She did her master's thesis on Corbett's Glen geology. And this is her drawing, and she even drew in the baseball diamond places. So that's a pretty good detail and helps to prove the point. But here's a wonderful documentation that was provided to us by Alan Mueller. This will come up a couple times during the talk. This has been doubled in size by Bill Burke. He's back there. It's called a circuit photograph, and Alan's father is in here. Here's Alan, and his father is the 12-year-old boy right there, right? And he was a messenger for the Ingle Machine Company. So the Ingle Machine Company will come in with the Gleason family in a few minutes. So, but the reason for showing you this is because this is the baseball diamond that I just pointed out over there. This is Burroughs property. This is where Burroughs Hills development is now. And this hill is still intact. It has trees on it, and the houses are all around it. You can't see it because it's all grown up from this location. Things are very different today than they were then. But the beautiful detail of the photograph, you see, you can tell who they are. You can see the railroad embankment over there. And you can see the chicken farm here where Harper's Trailer Park is now. And that looks like a tent. And there's the 54th Regiment Band. They came to Corbett's Glen a lot because we have other documentation of that. They were everywhere. But you know the tradition with these circuit photos is that since the camera panned slowly, you had time to get in the picture twice. So here's the director of the band right here. He looks like the most authoritative of them. Well, he's over here. Yeah. And a couple of those other guys that are in here are over there too.
There's actually only 3 people in there.
They just kept moving.
So Alan graciously gave us the original circuit photo. It's on our wall in our house and is a prized artifact of the Corbett's Glen history. It really says a lot because, thank you, there was such a friendship between the farmers that there were no property lines. They didn't matter. There was very little fear of a lawsuit or anything. They just used it, and yet it was not Patrick's property. So here's some other examples of the large picnics. That side of the hill, this is where the baseball diamond was there on Burroughs property. This is the side of the hill where people would get their pictures taken. And then these are other large picnics later on in the 50s and 70s. St. John Fisher, Bachelor's Group. brick church.
Jeff, are you going to talk about liquor?
Yeah, if you remind me.
And why these picnic grounds?
Yeah, Irish Catholic, that's it. This is in the middle of the Prohibition.
No, this is even before that. These private picnic grounds started in the late 19th century all over the United States because in most city or village or town-owned parks that were owned by the municipality, beer and liquor was not allowed in the public park. And many of the people who wanted, like the Ingle machine, you had a great deal of the population in the United States were from Europe. They were used to having wine or beer with a picnic. And if you went to Genesee Valley Park or Durand Eastman Park or Seneca, it was forbidden. So this was perfect. It was on the rail, it was on the trolley line. You could take, thousands of people had access to it. They could take the trolley, get off at Linden and East and walk down. And here in this private picnic ground, and there was one out in Garbutt near Mumford, you could have picnics and bring beer and bring wine. So that's one of the reasons this developed so much all over the United States, these private picnic grounds, because in public or city or town village parks, it was forbidden to bring any kind of liquor. So that's why you see these huge company picnics down there. And they had a beer pavilion, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you wouldn't have found that in a city-owned park or a town or village-owned park. That would have been not allowed.
I find it interesting culturally, being Irish Catholic. It was a given that they would drink. I don't know that Patrick ever drank, but he was certainly privy to what it meant. And there was as many as 2,500 people at one picnic at Corbett's Glen. Here it is, the Republicans' 13 ward, 2,500 guests, and half a ton of roast beef, 1,000 loaves of bread, 100 gallons of ice cream, 5,000 suckers, oodles of peanuts, and 600 gallons of soft drinks.
Yeah, right.
What date is that?
That's 1931.
Still prohibition.
So they didn't
Well,
advertise.
they didn't.
didn't
You think there was drinking there too? Well, it was political. It says no political speeches.
A
But
Republican meat picnic.
I don't know if they drank. You think they did?
I wouldn't venture a guess.
So they could station somebody during the height of Prohibition at whatever entrances to the Glen and give the signal if the police came anyway. But I don't know if that was an issue because it's private property. I really don't know how they handled that. There's record, Bambi Deverall is a local artist that just passed away, and she remembers hearing that they brought a carousel down into the Glen. And one guy my wife Deb took flying lessons out in Palmyra, and her flying instructor flew a biplane and landed it in the Glen to entertain the guests. That's what he told her. So the Burroughs farm is, according to history books, we have the record that it was considered the most beautiful farm in the area. And I think the reason is because these rolling hills were so bucolic. Look at that. I mean, it was the fencing and all, and the cows, and the stream and all. And so they took hundreds of photographs, beautiful quality photographs of that farm because they had such pride in it. And there's the original house that's well restored on Penfield Road. Before I got into this, I had worked on Bob Cornelison's Ampico player piano made in East Rochester. Bob and Jantino live in that house and are good stewards to it. And he has an Ampico Grand in his front living room. Well, next door is another Burroughs house that's just basically vacant, filled with lots of history. But in the house next door is the player piano. I'm a player piano guy. That was in that house. So that connection, the fact I worked for Bob Cornelison before I knew what the history of the house was, and it was a player piano, and then to find that the player piano is still in the family is all of great interest to me. So I think that covers pretty much everything. This is the new information that I've been waiting for years. Probably 15 years ago, I heard that Jan Gleason, who married into the Gleason family, was going to write a book about Kate Gleason. And Kate Gleason was the ideal of Susan B. Anthony. I can find the book. Jan is coming to Rochester on February 14th and 15th and 16th, I think, Tuesday and a Wednesday. She'll be giving a talk at the Kate Gleason Auditorium at the Rundell about this book. She spent a lot of time writing it, and I'm glad she spent all the time because she did a great job because she did a lot of good research. And Kate is one of my ideals because she did what she felt was important, not what other people thought she should do. So this is the story about her and her connection with Corbett's Glen. You know where Linden Oaks is now? Well, the house is right where Linden Oaks used to be, right where Linden Oaks is now. And it lasted up until 1975 before it was torn down. This is the house that she built, and based upon her childhood stories of Alhambra, she designed this house as Cindy Houck says, the most fanciful house ever built in the Rochester area. So it's a dream come to life. What happened with Kate is that as a young girl, she had a father and a mother who were good friends with Susan B. Anthony. And they were free thinkers. They didn't let Bishop McQuaid tell them that he had to send his kids to a parochial school. If they wanted to send their kid to a public school, they would. And they couldn't get the sacraments because of it. And he was outraged. So being a free thinker, her stepbrother was 20 years old when he died of the cholera around 1880 or so, around that era. And she overheard her father say to her mother, "Oh, if Kate were only a boy, because then he'd have somebody to take over the business." Well, the next day she went into the business and started working as a bookkeeper, and he let her do it. And he paid her that day $1, which she proceeded to lose, but that doesn't matter. She never lost another dollar. And so being a free thinker, she says, "I'm going to do for you. I love my parents. I'm going to do for you what you need done to keep this family going." So she became the bookkeeper, the secretary, treasurer, kept impeccable records, which is all well presented in this book right there. Beautiful records of her, all the finances of the Gleason Gear Company. They made tools. And I think she convinced her father to go into the bevel gear business. So they made a machine that made beveled gears, which makes it go around a corner. And they specialized in that. And she went out and was a saleswoman all over the world. And she played the part of a man all the way down the road. But she developed, having discussed this with Susan B. Anthony, she developed appreciation for the feminine ways and how she could get what she needed done by adopting frilly dresses and being aware of her hair and such. So when she went to Europe for the first time, because she needed to get away for some health purposes, she says, "Oh, I'm gonna, there's no place for me other than to go look up some work. I want people in Europe to buy our product." And so she went over in a cattle steamer out of Montreal, I think it was. She was the only woman on the ship. So what they did, all the guys wanted to be with her because she was just such a good sense of humor and a good way. They used a stopwatch, and they'd switch off each guy on the ship to spend a few minutes walking up and down the ship with her. And she loved it. She had 200 in her 200 marriage proposals in her records. And at one point when she made a trip to Asia, the scuttlebutt was that she almost gave in and got married, but she controlled herself. She must have fallen for some guy, but she loved the idea of just letting the relationship go so far because of the romance of it, and not going any further because then the romance would be gone. She just loved to play that over and over again. But she wanted to be in control. And in being in control, she worked a way for herself in the business that she had a name for herself all over the world. Men loved her. And she didn't find any discrimination at all because she had such a good way with everybody, to the point where her brothers were jealous of her, especially Andrew, the youngest. There was the brother that died, then there's Kate, and then there's two other brothers that went into the business. Naturally, by 1912, they said, either you leave the business or we leave the business. And she says, well, if you left the business, you wouldn't know what to do, so I'll leave. And she took a third of the stock. And so bicycles came along and cars and the First World War, and she became a millionaire very quickly because that product, that machine that made bevel gears, was very necessary for all the new technology that was coming along. And so with that money, she started her own businesses. She made these trailers here for cars. There's one packed up ready to go on the train in East Rochester. So when you got it, you'd take it and put it together yourself. But those trailers are able to take pianos around and people, and it even used as campers with a tent attached. She designed that. But she provided the money for these businesses. She built a lot of the buildings that are in East Rochester now. They're all cement because she used sand from her own sand quarry, which is where Linden Oaks is now, which we'll talk about a little later. So you have her moving out and on her own, being kicked out of the business, and wanting to make her way by designing this house. And you can see, even at a distance, how fanciful it was. And she moved in 1908. And she used sand from her sand pit. You can see the entrance to her from East Avenue here, and there's the Rochester and Eastern trolley, Rochester and Syracuse trolley. There's the railroad, there's her sand pit. So she went off of East Avenue over the railroad trolley tracks to her house right here, which is right there. And then she could also get in from Linden Avenue too, but she'd also have close eye on the guys taking the sand out of her sand pit. Basically, she bought up a lot of East Rochester and environs. So there's another poster that shows some of the property she owned. She started a country club. You can see back in 1923, these white spots are where the holes were. That house, she lived in there by herself, and then her sister lived with her. Her sister was the youngest of the children. She convinced her sister not to get married. She was perfectly eligible in every way to get married, but she was such a strong presence that the sister just ended up being a librarian for RIT. And lived in the house after Kate passed away in 1933. And so when the sister passed away, then the house was left vacant for years. So Jim Weller here remembers going through it in 1975.
Earlier than that.
Yeah.
10 years earlier, in the mid-1960s.
So here's an article about the to being a haunted house. So can you give us some reflections about the house going in it?
My memories are tenacious at best, but it was in the early to mid 1960s. The driveway extended from East Avenue across where Route 490 now passes from downtown Rochester out towards Pittsford, and across up into the Astor Drive, Brightford Heights area. That was the way you got up there. The driveway was a long circular driveway with a big loop at the front door. The front door was quite interesting. It was a double big oak door, but before you got to the oak door, there was a series of steps coming up, and there was a big heavy iron grate in front of it, so that would swing open. And there was the double oak doors, and you stepped into the oak doors, and there was a series of steps going up in about 3 different tiers, 3 steps and a flat area, and then 3 more steps. But down the center, which was the fascinating thing, was a flowing waterfall. And the water trickled down and was full of all sorts of greens and ferns and moss and frogs, what have you. And anyway, you came up to the top landing, you stepped into a very large room, probably 4 times the size of this room. It was all oak paneled or walnut paneled, quite dark. It was a 2-story room, and the most interesting part of the room was that about 12 or 15 feet up, there was a balcony that extended all the way around the room. And on the right-hand wall, there was a staircase. And this staircase was probably one of the more unique components of the room, because the staircase, as Jeff talked about, Kate was quite the romantic. This staircase was, we don't know why it was there, but the staircase moved. And when she would go up to her boudoir, the staircase, by pulling on a rope, would close. Now, we don't know if it was to keep the rascals out or to keep the rascals in. But anyway, the staircase went up and would lock up in place. And then she had her private quarters or apartment up there. And near her bedchamber was a tower. And she could go up the tower, and the tower probably went up 15, 20 feet above the top of the house. And it was all glass surrounded, and she could spy over the countryside, looking for the young men who were trying to escape, apparently. But it was quite a gorgeous house. It was all stucco. It was done in a very Moorish style, lots of Moorish arches around the windows, lots of Arabic symbolism and figures and characters written about, lots of tile and interior gardens. Had a big interior courtyard with natural gardens and palm trees, and a big glass ceiling above it, which would roll out of the way on ball bearings, and the light would come down in the water. So it was quite an elegant place. The purpose, the land got left to RIT, and the will stated that the land was to be used for educational purposes. And it was her vision, at least in my view, was her vision that because the University of Rochester owned the land where Oak Hill Country Club is currently located, John Fisher and Nazareth were not quite a gleam in anyone's eye yet. But my thought was that she figured that the east side of town, where the U of R originally was located at downtown Women's Campus, this would be an ideal spot for the RIT campus of the future. However, RIT had a different view, and they determined that educational purposes meant whatever they wanted it to be, and they sold the land, using the money for their other purposes. So that's briefly the story of the Kate Gleason house and some of its history. Some very representative photographs are up there. It was a gorgeous place, but it did fall into disrepair because the folks at RIT just didn't use it, and kids in the neighborhood did, and that was the end of it.
How many acres? How many acres?
The whole parcel was over 100 acres. The parcel was subdivided or divided by the construction of Route 441 back in the 1960s. They cut it in half. And that brought it down to about 50-50. And then there was a lot of pressure to develop this large section of land, which is on the Penfield, Pittsford, and Brighton borders. 3 towns there. And over a period of years, between the 60s and up until the 80s, a number of proposals were made. There was a company called Zaremba out of Cleveland, and the Zaremba group wanted to build low-income, high-rise apartments in that area. That didn't fly. Then another group came in and they wanted to build a high-technology manufacturing district where they'd be having everything from smelters to chemicals to what have you. That was the subject of a lawsuit, and that went away. And then the replacement was the current Linden Oaks. That also went through many, many years of litigation until they changed from this high-technology office manufacturing to an office park and an office medical park. So it's a pretty good use for the land, quite scenic and quite pleasant up there now, but that's how it got to be.
Were they able to recycle any of the parts of the infrastructure?
I doubt it. I never heard of anything. For several years after 490 joint venture, which was owned by Robert Giannini and his family, acquired the property for development as Linden Oaks, there was a sunken garden still on the property with a big Moorish arch, and you could wander through the stones and what have you, but that is now a parking lot. So, yes, sir.
Before 441 went in, did the holdings abut the back end of St. John Fisher?
Her holdings went from, it wrapped around Brightford Heights, almost up to John Fisher, and it went all the way up to Linden Avenue, right to where the small railroad overpass is. She had a right-of-way into there, and then she also owned frontage on Linden Avenue. And then, of course, right where the medical office complex is, it was where the sand pit, or pits, were. And if you can think of this, from the pizza shop on Linden Avenue, or the trailer parks, all the way to East Avenue, used to be one solid mound of sand. So that was excavated not solely by Ms. Gleason, but by several other predecessors, and I'm sure Jeff will talk about that in some detail. But that was called the sand cut.
Oh, yes, that's a great story. Looking for my...
And I'll talk about the sand cut if you want to hear about that briefly. When the New York Central Railroad was being built through that area around 1853, straight and level was the way the engineers wanted to operate their trains. And when they came to this area, there was this big hill. And to get straight and level, you carve a notch through the hill, put the tracks through. In doing so, they found out it was wonderful, clean sand. And that sand became the ballast for much of the railroad construction all throughout this area. And it went from 1 track to 2 tracks to 4 tracks, and it got progressively wider. As it got wider and longer, they decided this was far too valuable a commodity to just ignore, so they put a siding in to this area. And for many, many years, there was 2 concrete buildings on the site where the railroad tracks ran into these. And the siding, the buildings were, I don't know, 15 feet or so tall, just big enough for a gondola car or two to pull through. And up on the roof of the cement buildings were holes, 3 or 4 foot square, where the pony and donkey carts would bring the sand loads up, dump them into the holes, into the gondola cars, and then they pull the gondola cars out onto the tracks. And they used that dirt, by the way, among other things, to fill in or to elevate all the tracks in downtown Rochester. They used to be all at grade level, and back in the 1890s, they brought them up to an elevated status, so they weren't having those multitudinous accidents they had back in that period of time. So that's where most of that sand came from. And they also used the sand to fill in the area where the trestle was in Corbett's Glen. And that sand pit was operated by the Elam brothers, who are still around in one form or another, from about 1910, when Kate Gleason first acquired the land, up until the 1940s, at which point it stopped being used as an active sand pit. Thank you.
So Kate worked for the Elam family?
Yes, the Elams had a contract with Kate Gleason. She was the owner of the land, and they used to pay her
$1 square yard,
$1.50 a yard to remove the sand off the property. And just before she died, she decided that somebody was pulling off a little more sand than the dollars warrant, and so there was a suit. When in doubt, sue. And the Elams came to court, and their defense was, Your Honor, it would be irreparable damage to our business if she shut us down and kept us off the property. We'll arrange for a good accounting and we'll settle this matter up. That was the last anybody heard of the suit, so apparently she got enough money, or the Elams were able to do whatever they had to do. And the construction and the sand mining continued on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
When we moved into Corbett's Glen in 1984, we wandered up into this area where Kate's house was, and I remember the sunken garden and the gear-shaped motif of the, and so I was curious, and I feel very fortunate to have somebody here like that presents it so well, that remembers so well what it was like, because it is a fantasy, and here's somebody that could bring a fantasy to life because of the circumstances she set up earlier in life by having such a good work ethic as everybody else did, and knowing how to deal with money. It all paid off for her to be able to bring a dream and a lot of dreams to life. So here she is in the doorway. You can see her standing around there, different places. And naturally, I want to figure out, oh, what did it look like on the outside? And, well, we have pretty much two sides shown here. People usually photograph the front of it. The front of it is right here. That's where the driveway is, and that's where people went in. And yet, there's no tower there. There is a tower here, so she must have added the tower later. That's something we don't know anything about. This might have been right after she moved in. And where is the skylight? Well, the skylight is here and here, but it seems to be where the tower was. I don't know. Those are the kind of questions that I'd want these photographs to answer for me, but it's still unclear how things were configured. But whatever, Kate was, you should bring out those bird's eye views now. You don't have to put them up, just hold, well, I'll do that. I can. So one of my dreams, thank you, was to bring together the three bird's eye views of Rochester. Here's the earliest one, 1853, looking to the east. We all have seen that one. And here's the next one to come along. This is the one I wanted so badly, and Bill Burke printed it up for me. When I did it, it came out like that. This is how it, when it's done professionally, it comes out. So what this shows me is it's a record of different areas of interest. And in this case, the area of interest is, that one's the third one of the three that I know of. That's 1880. That's the last of the three bird's eye views. That's looking south. That's looking north from the south, Mount Hope. And so this is the first time that I know of in recent history that all three of these bird's eye views have been in one place together. I know no other institution that has all three. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So the way I used this one already for research is, I have this photograph here of the Gleason Works down in the milling area along the river. And the guys are standing here in front of the factory, and there's where the power from the water power is transmitted to another building. So I look at this and I see, there's that building, and I blew it up so you can see it a little better here. There's the building, and in the records it says next to the Gleason building was the cotton mill, and there's the cotton mill. And on top of that cotton mill was a bell, and that bell summoned people to work every day at 5 in the morning. And they were putting in a 65-hour week at that time. And So that bell fell down into the basement when the building burned, and James, the son, bought it and kept it and put it in the foundry on University Avenue. And then when that changed, he took it out to Honeoye Falls, where Gleason had a subsidiary called Cunningham Crossbar Switch, which my father invented. The crossbar switch is the device that made phone women obsolete, switching women, telephone operators obsolete. And when they said it was stored in Honeoye Falls, I said, oh, that's right, there is a connection. Gleason bought out Cunningham, and my father made the crossbar switch, and that was made at the end of the era in Honeoye Falls. Before that, it was made on Canal Street near the Susan B. Anthony house. So here's my mother, and she was married to my father who designed it. Right here. You want to stand up? Gene Vincent. So Gleason bought different businesses, and they bought Cunningham until the computer age came in and made that obsolete. But I have an example of it. I was able to purchase it from Nassau. They were throwing it out and somebody kept it, and they sold it to us on eBay. So we have an example of the crossbar switch. It was used in the White House. It was used all over the place for switching purposes. So that's off the subject, except the fact it's connected with me. And that bell came back to Rochester, and this is where they installed it, right in front of the factory on University Avenue. It's there now, and you can go up and ring it. So I rang it the other day, and here's what it sounds like. Nice and loud. That'll do it. Yeah. Yeah, it was made in Troy. Beautiful sound. And when I was there, the guy that greeted me at the door was so helpful. He gave me all this literature on the history of it. And he was the one that rang the bell for me. He took a broom handle and worked it. And the guy across the street, you can hear in the recording, was clapping, and he was so excited. So that's really on University Avenue, right in front of the Gleason Works factory. That factory's been there since 1905, and Kate was probably responsible to some extent for everything involved with it. This is what it looks like during the First World War. And this is what it looks like on a plat map in 1926. That's what it looked like when it was new. Probably looks like that today, to some extent, if you flew over it. So Kate was out of the picture by this time, though. She was just getting the money from their business to do her own businesses. And she, among other things, was a president of the bank in East Rochester for 2 years. So she signed this $20 bill. And so she got into everything. She traveled all over the world, and she had property in South Carolina and California that she built on because she loved building things. And she'd witnessed some pretty terrible fires in the Browns Race area as a child, and she really went for this cement thing because then you didn't have to worry about fires. So everything that she did, the Concrest in East Rochester, those houses that she built right here, you've all seen those. They're not doing too well because they're a little bit smaller than today's population is comfortable in. So they're kind of a blight on East Rochester. But they'll be there another 100, 200 years because that's the way she built them. And they only went for $4,000 back in 1925. And it was something that people could afford as opposed to an apartment. It was a step up. And there was a need for that because you had the car shops and you had the biggest piano factory in the world right there in East Rochester, and people had to find places to live. So she was providing that for people. She owned property in France during the war because she wanted to help after the First World War to bring a town back to health after it had been bombed. So she bought some castles and properties and reconstructed them, and they had a parade for her and celebrated her contributions after the First World War. So she got into everything. She gave lots of money to Rochester, and she's known as a benefactor in many areas. So there's her father, and there's Jan Gleason, the lady that wrote the book, and her husband. He's the great-grandson of the founder. And they came to Rochester and signed the book a month or two ago at the Kate Gleason School of Engineering at RIT. That's where that was held. So there's the Kate Gleason Auditorium, Kate Gleason everything, because her money is just spread all over this community. So she was good friends with other philanthropists like George Eastman. And when she entertained at her house, she had people like Clarence Darrow, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and the president of Cornell, White, the first president, very good friends. And so she was moving in these circles, and they all liked her because she was such a nice, pleasant, pleasurable, intelligent individual. So the sex division didn't exist. She proved herself at every step. I like to see that. This next subject, the notorious sand cut. This is what took place before Kate owned the property. She was about 14 years old when this took place. And this is a very interesting story that Jim uncovered in his research on Fulton postcards, a very great site on the internet. Lots of articles in the newspaper that shed light on any subject you type in. So here we have Linden Oaks. This is taken from Google. Bill did this with me last summer. And there's 441, there's the New York Central line, and there's Linden Oaks. And this is where there was a 100-foot tall sand moraine where Jim said the railroad had to get through, so they cut a sand cut. And because it was shaped like this, whenever there was a lot of wind, the sand would fill in, or the snow. And at one point in 1879, in December, there were one big snowstorm after another, 2 big snowstorms, and they filled in that cut. Here's a representation of what the cut might have looked like. Now it's not there because it's been quarried away. So what happened was that it happened to be during those snowstorms that Vanderbilt, who owned the New York Central Railroad, Commodore, his daughter, I think it was, or daughter-in-law, was in Rochester with her husband, who was associate with a famous miller who had just died, and they were at his funeral. And they wanted to get back to New York City, so Vanderbilt, thinking he could do anything, orders his men in Rochester, New York, and the New York Central to get them out of there, out of Rochester at all costs. Everything else was stopped. Nobody could go anywhere. But the guys' jobs were on the line, so they took these 4 passenger cars, there they are right there, 2 of them, and pulled them out of Rochester with 11 steam locomotives and a plow on the front. And there's the plow right there. And you can see it didn't turn out too well. They went at that blockage of snow at 15 miles an hour with these 11 steam locomotives. And it was so dense that all the steam locomotives came off the track. And there they are. This story made the world news. It made the London newspapers. So when you go over 441, next time going past Linden Oaks, you can imagine this scene in 1879 where the engineer in the first locomotive was killed instantly. Other locomotive engineers beyond were injured. Nobody in the passengers was injured. That stayed on the track. So somebody gave him a description of what it looked like, and then Leslie's Illustrated put this in their newspaper because it was such a spectacular accident. And this was acquired at the Rochester Historical Society, which is now located down at the Rundell Library. And Bill Keeler said, "Oh, I know, I did a story on that. And here's the lithograph." And I went nuts because here's a wonderful representation of local Corbett's Glen related history, where all that sand was a liability. It created circumstances for a lot of accidents and burglaries because when going up that slowly up that grade through the sand cut, the burglars could get in and rob people and be off by the time it got past. So these are some articles that Jim came up with about the things that took place in the sand cut that are so colorful in their nature of things that crime and accidents that took place in the sand cut. So it was a liability to the railroad. So they said, okay, let's get rid of that liability. Like Jim says, we'll use the sand. We'll solve two problems at the same time. The sand cut will be taken away, and we'll use the sand for all our projects. And then after that, Kate Gleason uses it for her projects. So what happens in 1853, or 1879, the 1853, the trestle goes in. 1879, they fill it in. This is just a drawing of what it might have looked like. This is a drawing of what the trestle likely looked like. And so based on records that we have here, here's a commissioner's report from 18 probably 60, describing this bridge, this trestle. Since we don't have any photographs, Bill and I were forced to come up with some other way to represent it. So what it says here is it used a burr truss. So Bill found what a burr truss looks like right here. And it says there are 110 feet between each one, and there were 5 of them, and it gave the length and the height. So there is the first drawing rendition of the trestle that we have seen in recent history of what it looked like without having a photograph. So here's a picture in our basement of one of those trestle beams. And there's what a burr truss looks like today on some wheels. There's what the trestle looks like and the embankment looks like after it was filled in 1879. And with the trains going over. This next one is about Kate's property. So we've discussed some of these things, and these are representations that you might want to look out for down the road. So you're going east on 441 into Penfield. There's the railroad track. There's 441. Here's Linden Oaks. And there's the trailer park. And right here was the sand cut. So if you go up into Linden Oaks and drive back where the parking lot is and look over the side, it goes down 100 feet. That was all mined away. So you get a frame of reference here as to what it looks like today, and imagine what it looked like with the high walls on both sides and filled in with snow, and that accident right here, I suspect. So Here's a photo of an air view looking southeast, 490, 441, and there's where Kate's house was. There's the railroad track, there's our house right there. There's the Corbett house. So,
Would the sand cut have been somewhere in that photo?
no, it's further east here. And if you go up to Brightford Heights, past Kirk and Astor, there's the breakout for the driveway to her house. It's all that's left. This is where her road was, from East Avenue coming up to her house. And there's the house, the front entrance with a fountain and gardens. She had a friend named Helen, a good friend that she quoted once. She said, I just purchased 25 acres in front of my house to make into a garden. She says, for a mogul that lives in Penfield, Brighton, and Pittsford, and that mogul is me. So she planned on putting in 25 acres of gardens. I don't know how far she got along in that project, but she loved gardens, as indicated by the plants in her atrium. The skylight was 35 feet tall, so the palm trees were, and the trees were that tall inside the house. So here we have another aerial view showing the sand cut and her house. This is 1923, and we have a representation of her land and a plat map of East Rochester. It's Kate Gleason. Here we have an example of a connection between Patrick Corbett and Kate Gleason, because it says Patrick Corbett's property here, down in Florida. Patrick had property, couple properties. All around the Glen he had property for farming, so he farmed this. Next it says Kate Gleason owned this too. So did they know each other? I don't know. But whatever, when Patrick passed away, he had an estate of $25,000, which is equivalent to $1 million and a half today. For a dirt farmer, that's pretty impressive. He parlayed everything into good, substantial assets. He paid cash for everything. We have a receipt of him buying a truck, a new truck for moving his vegetable products to market. He paid $3,000 cash for it. Everything was cash. So as a result, he left quite a nice estate to his family. But Kate left $1.5 million back in 1933. Patrick died in 36, $25,000. Both respectable sums. So, yes.
The railroad track, in the picture right next to your shoulder there, it's kind of a grade. What they did was they elevated it, and it's part of the North Shore line that goes right through Rochester, so it's a main line. And generally what they did to keep the grade constant, they would build a trestle to get the train in, because it's faster building a trestle. Then after that's in, then they fill it in with fill, which is probably a lot of the same.
Yes, that was the procedure. They knew it was temporary. Yes. Yes. They knew that trestle was just a way to keep things moving, but eventually something else had to be done. So this is a classic example of how they use resources to make it more permanent. But it'd be neat to see them doing it, I'll tell you.
It's more expensive to build the trestle than it was to do it with fill. But for expediency, they would spend the money, build the trestle, and then fill it.
And then they could pour it right down through the track. I think that covers this. Here's something I picked up the other day. Sorry. This is a 1935 geological survey of the East Rochester area, and there's the Hillcrest Country Club. That is hers. She started that, and There's her East Avenue going to her house. And you can see the abandoned, this is 1935. The Rochester and Syracuse stopped running around 1930. So that's the abandoned trolley tracks in a geological sense. I don't know how accurate it is. I think the railroad is much further over this way, but whatever. I'd love to see some more clear representations of the country club. That became haunted also. So we have an article showing the haunted country club and pictures of what it looked like. Because a lot of famous golfers started out there at that country club that she started, and they would come back in later years when it was abandoned and probably have sentimental feelings towards it. Speaking of golfers, we mentioned Walter Hagen having grown up. He was born in this house. He didn't go to a hospital. He was born right in this house where the Beers live now, Adams family. And he started out with his father he worked at the piano factory, and he bought a piano for his sister, and he was, I think it was 5th grade. It was a nice day, and he was in the Ellens Creek School, and the window was open, and he loved golf, and he lived to play golf, and he literally jumped out the window and never came back and became a millionaire. So I think you'll find in history that most of the people that do that end up millionaires because they know, they're directed, they know what they want out of life. Those of us that keep going, we find out later. But he was directed. He knew what he wanted. He went with it. He had all the charisma that was necessary to make his way. So he's one of our famous sons in the Corbett's Glen area.
How long did he live there?
Well, I think the family was there from way early on, 1860 until 1926. There's his father. The family did not take photographs. Actually, somebody gave Walter Hagen a camera when he was at one of his competitions, and he took about 500 pictures or something, and none of them came out. So there's no record of the family's other than a few anecdotes about him growing up and walloping balls over the embankment kind of thing. There was a cow pasture in back, and he appropriated that for his own little golf course, and there are fun stories about that. 1924. The water in Ellens Creek was pretty bad, I guess, because all the homes, the water from their sewers went right into the creek. And so the town of Brighton had to do something about it. So they tried with this sewage treatment plant in 1924. And there it is, the first version. And they updated it in 1960. We have pictures of that also. But in Linden Oaks, there's a contractor that was clearing out their files, and they found this envelope filled with photographs of this. So we have 40 photographs of the construction of this sewage treatment plant in 1924, showing horse-drawn equipment. There's the chicken farm, steam equipment right here, and this is the entrance to Corbett's Glen right here. This is the beginning of the tunnel going through here. This is the railroad track. This is the Stam house, which is now where Deb and Dave Flatoff live. And what's interesting here is that, well, why would you have a construction shed next to the Glen? Well, they had to get those pipes from Brighton over through the embankment to get the water to the sewage treatment plant on the east side. So in order to get through the embankment underneath the railroad track, they put another tunnel diagonally. So it went like this, from the tunnel, from the Corbett's Glen culvert right here. Up here, they started and went through underneath, and there it is. There's a photograph. They're using a railroad track through the tunnel. And there's the guys working in there. And then they put two 36-inch pipes through, and then they backfilled it. And those pipes are still there, and I'm sure these timbers are still there, and I'm sure the timbers to the trestle are still there. So I'm going to get digging. Any questions? Actually, at the time these pictures were taken, the Shenandoah dirigible was in Rochester. So one of the pictures is taken from the Shenandoah dirigible of Corbett's Glen.
One of the other side stories about the tunnel and why it got built is Allen Creek basically was an open sewer. Septic systems didn't work as well as they would like to, and Allen Creek had been known as the trout stream, but by the mid to late 1920s there were no trout there. But there's also a very interesting real estate development taking place, in that a gentleman by the name of Henry C. Marsh bought a big chunk of land from the Jenkins farm. The Jenkins farm was located at the corner of East Avenue and Knollwood. Mr. Marsh was the developer of the Knollwood Drive area. Mr. Marsh was also commissioner of the Brighton-Pittsford Sewer District. And in order to get his development in, he needed sewers. And strangely enough, a sewer system developed. Then what sewer?
Here's a buckle of Patrick Corbett's. It says Canadian Boy Scouts on it. And I found it in the dump out back of our house. It's brass, so it'll last forever, you know. And back to the Hagen story, I like to make connections with different happenstances. We have a piano in our house which was made in East Rochester. It's a Chickering make with an Ampico system which gives expression. It's a player piano with expression purchased by industrialists that had money. Very expensive mechanism. And I'll play a recording of it here for you. It's as if the pianist is sitting there playing it with all the expression. Well, the connection between that piano and Walter Hagen is that there's this guy, Clarence Hickman, who was a prolific inventor. He had hundreds of patents during the First, Second World War in artillery and archery. And he had this machine he used called a spark chronograph, and it measured the velocity of things. So he was hired to redesign this mechanism that was made in East Rochester for our piano to make expression. He used the spark chronograph to measure the velocity of the hammers. As Rachmaninoff would be playing in New York City, he'd have a reading of speed for every hammer that was hit. And then they could incorporate that speed into a vacuum level to make the hammer hit at a certain volume. And so he used that spark chronograph quite liberally in his new design of the Ampico that we have in our house. It came out in 1929. Well, he also, Clarence Hickman knew Walter Hagen, because it says right here that, I guess I'll read it, it's only a paragraph. While at the piano company, Hickman performed many archery experiments which will be covered later, but he also utilized the spark chronograph to do some research on golf. He measured the velocity of the club head and ball for many professional golfers, including Walter Hagen. The pros recommended that the golfer follow through with a rationale that one could increase the velocity of the ball by pushing the ball after contact had been made. Hickman knew this could not be done, but carefully analyzed the spark chronograph readings. He found that when a golfer attempted to follow through, the maximum velocity of the club head was nearer the ball. So although he could not affect velocity after the ball was hit, attempting to follow through caused the golfer to obtain a greater velocity of the club head prior to contacting the ball. This was one of the first attempts to scientifically prove a teaching cue or method. So there's the connection, and here's what our piano sounds like. This is considered the most sophisticated pneumatic system ever devised. It's a wonder, a mechanical wonder of the world. So that was all made in East Rochester, and I'm amazed because it's so involved, yet they made money on it until the Depression came along, and soon after it was introduced, no more demand for such things, and they only made a few of them. And so there are a few left, and being a tuner, I was tuning for Hillside Children's Center, and they hired me also to come appraise this piano that was in their auditorium, used for accompaniment. And I looked at it and I said, you hire somebody else to appraise it, I want to buy it. And so they had somebody else appraise it for what it would be as a normal piano, and that was very reasonable, and we bought it, and so now it brings great joy while I wash the dishes. So I'm going to play a couple organs for you now. I'll come in from the back playing. When I was 5 years old, my parents took me to Plymouth Rock, and I saw an organ grinder, and I said, that's it, that's what I'm doing. And it was an organ just like this one. Craig and I have lots of fun on play dates, getting together, Craig Smith here, and restoring these organs. He does the good, hard stuff, and I do the easy stuff. So there's 7 tunes on here, 32 pipes. The idea was get the most music out of the smallest box. So I had another organ at Cornhill one day in the 70s. And a lady came up to me, Annabelle Frankenstein, Lester Frankenstein's wife. And she says, I have one of those in my living room sitting next to the Steinway Grand. It's been there since my mother bought it for a costume party for $1, ever since the 20s. And I said, well, I'd like to buy it. So I went over that night and bought it. She lived right down the street from us on East Avenue. It's the nicest sounding organ. I've worked on 80 of them thus far. Nicest sounding organ I've ever heard. The arrangements are such that this is being made in 1920. The music was Tin Pan Alley, exciting. The generations of builders had learned their trade and learned all the tricks and how to get the most out of the smallest. And this is it. So I'll bring over another one.
Jeff, while you're tell them about the movie.
So the event that got this whole Corbett's Glen publicity going was that a guy in Michigan called us and said, there's this movie I've picked up, and it seems to be of Corbett's Glen. I'd like to see if you guys called up Jean Barrick, the head of the Corbett's Glen Preservation Group, asked her, do you know who it is in this film? What group? Well, again, we said, no, but we'd like to buy the film. So we bought it, and had it digitized, and now it's on DVD. It's 16 millimeter, 34 minutes long, of a classic picnic in Corbett's Glen. So you have the people getting off the trolley. Rochester and Syracuse, and then walking down into the Glen, going over the bridge through the tunnel. Patrick Corbett is in the movie, greeting everybody, and then the fun starts. It's a gambling, getting drunk, games, all that stuff. The movie shows it all. So we're showing that movie over here behind Andy. So does that cover it? Where's Cindy? Yes, okay.
Play this and then we'll.
Oh, okay. This is the last tune. This is 90 pounds. And it would have been on a stick. I have a stick with me. I just didn't bring it. It's over on the wall back there. I should probably put it up so you can see, but I will. Thank you. No, I want to do it right. Here it is. Here's the stick. This is proved you can hold 90 pounds of an organ. It was made in Germany, turn of the century. Came over to the States, then to Mexico City. The guy there had 50 of them. He pinned the music on it, and they rented the organs out during the day, and 3 or 5 of them are still down there being played, just like this. They're national treasures, but none of them sound good, because the guys that play them don't understand music. But this is the one that Craig brought this back from Chicago on the airplane for us. He happened to be on a business trip, and the dealer in Chicago delivered it to him at the airport, and he brought it back. I don't think you can get away with that anymore. But this is what that guy, these are Mexican Revolution songs. It's from Mexico City. Yeah.
How much does it weigh?
90 pounds. A pound of pipe. That's what we say, right?
By the time I got it to the airport, it told me a lot more than that. You should briefly mention the day we had that organ, your other Molinary, 3 of mine, in our driveway, and what happened that day.
What happened? You mean Claudia?
Yeah. These were made in, tell them where they were made and then what happened.
They're made in Brooklyn from 1860 to 1940. And one of the relatives, a great-granddaughter of the founder, wanted to have an example of her relative's work. And so she brought us photographs of the factory, which they lived upstairs in Brooklyn and the factory was downstairs, typical arrangement. And Craig sold her one of his Molinaris, and we...
To Claudia Molinari.
Yeah, to one of the surviving relatives. Yeah. This organ has, like I said, Mexican Revolution songs, but apparently the guy that owned them, that pinned the music, he had seen Charlie Chaplin's movie Limelight, which came out around 1952. And he was apparently so taken with the movie, not the least of which is because the start of the movie, there's an organ, a barrel piano out in the street with the kids. And so he loved that movie so much, ostensibly, that he immortalized. You see, Charlie Chaplin wrote all the music for that movie. And Eternal, da 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 da, was the main theme. He put that on this organ. He pinned it at that era, and that was, he loved it, the movie so much that it's on here. But I won't play it because Charlie says to stop. Thank you. Yes. Do you want to buy cookbooks on the way out? That'd be great. A memento.
Go to the Glen.
They go to the Glen effort.